Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a volunteer with the Windsor Essex Sewing Force. I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to make channels on the Essex Pleated Mask or even the Windsor Hybrid Mask. These are masks that we're sewing based on evidence-based practices and decision making. Before we start sewing our channel on, I'm going to talk a minute about your seam allowance. Having an accurate seam allowance is very important because if your seam allowance is off, it changes the dimension of the mask at the end and can actually change the sizing. So right here I'm showing you that we have the difference between a 1/4 inch seam, a 3/8 inch seam, and a 1/2 inch seam. By the time you multiply that times the two layers of fabric that go together, it can make your mask size off by as much as an inch. So it's very important to sew this at a 1/2 inch seam. And before I start sewing for the day or start a new project, I always sew a little scrap of fabric and then check it with a measuring tool. Now this may sound like a lot of work for making masks, but having accurate seams is going to make the channels go so much more smoothly. And you are just going to love this new method. So I've already done the first method, or the first side to show you. And right now what we're going to do is place the mask channel on top of the front of the mask, tuck the channel underneath, and then just gently slide it into under your presser foot. Now this can be chain pieced, which means sewing one after the other, but for today's purposes I'm just going to do one. Okay, so I start sewing, and you notice I'm going to back stitch over it. And you can even do that when you're chain piecing. That back stitch is really important because it allows for stability in the mask, because the point at which the mask and the channels touch is probably the point of the mask that gets the most wear and use on it. And here again at the end I'm just backing up and locking my stitch in place. There we go. Now that I've sewn both mask channels on with the mask facing the front, I'm going to flip the channel over and turn it to the right side. And at this point you can either finger press it down or iron it. I'm going to iron it because I like a nice crisp seam, and for the purposes of this video I'd like it to turn out perfect. I'm making sure my edges are turned under, and I'm giving a quick press at the iron and then bringing it back to the sewing machine. I am going to now do my top stitching or edge stitching all the way across the channel, right down the front of the mask into the other channel. And you'll notice that you already see edge stitching there, and that's because I'm working off a huge stack of masks that I started using the channels the old way, and now I'm going to just do the new way. So if you have a stack like that, you don't need to repeat this, but for these purposes, so you can see what I'm doing, I'll show you. So we're just going very close to the edge. Sewing along the edge. Catching the other edge. Some of the masks we've seen come in don't always tack this edge down, and by doing this it gives it not only more stability and durability in the long run, it also makes it much easier to pull either ties or elastic through. Now I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. Just continue stitching right onto the mask. This top stitching both at the same time really takes away a whole step. And although I'm sewing the Essex Pleated here, you can use the same technique on the Windsor Hybrid. Now that I have sewn the mask, tacked down the top stitching, the edges, I didn't quite catch it there, but that's okay. I'm going to secure the channels in place. Before I start, sew this down, I want to compare this to the old way of making the channels, and that was where had you folding over, sewing this separately, lining up separately on the front, and then folding over. It was a lot of fighting with the channels. You'll see this is much smoother because it covers this edge here, which is going to make it much smoother. So I'm going to fold the fabric in. First, finger press across the front. So at the end of once we have the channels on, we want to make sure that this channel is folded completely across the front of the mask. Then we're going to come back and fold the edge in just enough to make sure that we've covered that seam on the back and turn the mask in. Next step, when you also may want to check it, because when we sew on the front, we're going to want to make sure that we're catching this little seam here. And I'll show you why. Because if you do not catch, I had to make up a few mistakes. Actually, that wasn't hard for me. If you do not catch the seam on the inside, when you sew your mask, you'll find that this little hem here comes out, leaving an unfinished edge, which not only can cause the mask to wear out more quickly because of fraying, but can also create a little bit of irritation on the cheek. So make sure that you do catch it. So I am making, and one way to make sure of that is if you have a full 1/2 inch seam here and you make sure that your little edge is covering the seam, then you flip it back over, and now I'm going to sew the mask on the front. And what I'm doing is sewing right in the ditch, or which is basically where the two seams meet each other. If you're not comfortable with that, you can also sew right along the edge, which I've done. It doesn't matter if there's a little seam right next to that. It's just your comfort level. And you, oops, sorry. Now I'm going to go and check on the back side. You can see that I have caught this edge. And just a nice little seam. I deviated a little bit there, but that's fine. Just to show you again, another way you can make sure that you're doing this is that if you are not sure you can catch this seam, and honestly it took me a lot of mask before I could do that, I just went ahead and you can sew it on the back instead of the front just by moving it over. I'll show you that here. I'm not sure if I did this the last one, but it is very important to back stitch at the start and the end of the channel so that it's very secure, because when the elastic goes through, that's the part it's going to tug on. Okay, so you can see here it does leave a little bit of a seam, but that's okay. It's just one seam and it's nice and neat. And as always, we want to make sure we trim our little threads. Not only does it keep it from unraveling, it just looks a little bit nicer, and make sure that nothing gets caught in the wash. Okay, so that is, I want to show you a couple things also to look out for in making your channels. So I showed you the old construction versus the new. This is another example of the new way to make it, and notice how smooth and nice it looks that way. And in this one I did sew on the back, and you can see even though it's a contrasting thread, it looks perfectly nice. I'm showing the mask already made, but I want to talk about making sure your mask sides line up before you put your channels on. You want to, after you make your pleats and before you sew your channels, or sew your pleats down, you want to make sure that it's perfectly aligned so that both sides of the mask are the same. If you don't do that, what you'll have is a mask with two different sides, which will be uncomfortable to the wearer and make them be constantly adjusting their mask, and that's not